Hey, hello everyone.
I,
I'm going to do a workshop on trade and IR. It is going to be somewhere where it is going to be a bit beginner level, but still is going to be a bit advanced in the sense that I'm going to assume you already know about the basics of trade and all that kind of stuff. So, what am I going to discuss? Just the absolute basics of these kinds of motions, because oftentimes it's very easy to get caught up in, focusing on things that are like very big picture, very specific. We will just forget to do the generic stuff you could do with trade. But I'm just going to go into a bit more depth about supply chains and supply lines. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about like competitions, and they are part of trade. This all in all should be finished relatively quickly, and it's going to be somewhat interactive. Maybe not as interactive as other workshops, because sometimes you just need to hear how to work out an economic argument, and then you can just steal the analysis and then you can use it for yourself. But there's still going to be some questions and exercises along the way. So then this just is immediately an important note. Don't overcomplicate the issue. Oftentimes they're just, very simple things that you can consider within trade. And again, like I said, I just assume that you know the basics. So I'm just going to ask you a question immediately. What are the absolute basic explanations of why more trade is good? Is anyone there to say or speak?
Uh, I can try, I think. I think it just increases the amount of produce you're able to put into the market, which means more people are needed to actually produce those things, which means on the ground you probably have more jobs, but because people are paying you for those things and you probably have a profit margin over those things, because obviously that's capitalism, you also as a country get like higher GDP and then the good number goes up.
Yeah, that's right. GDP goes. Someone else have something to say?
Depending on what time frame you're looking at, in the medium to long run, also depending on what you are producing, you can attract talent from other places. So especially if you're specialized in more high-end goods, which is not the case everywhere, you might attract workers to your country, which increases your long-run productivity because you get a reputation for being the country that trades X thing.
Yeah, it's also good. Talents. And how would you impact that? Like just having more talent in the country?
Well, it has a lot of effects in different places, but I think the intuitive ones are productivity goes up because they have knowledge that allows them to do stuff faster than people you have to train for those jobs. They might also initiate some startups or expand on existing businesses because maybe they have more knowledge about that particular niche that you are trading in as a country. They might make it easier for your country as a whole to gain knowledge on this because maybe they develop the education system in such a manner or they become trainers in different corporations and so on. And also, maybe they pay higher taxes because knowledge migrants are usually higher paid. And maybe that's good for the government.
Okay. Yeah, that's also good. There's a lot of like detail already on like different aspects, education, more taxes, all that kind of stuff. Why do you also want to try like a basic idea of why more trade is good?
I was thinking about currency. So for example, if you, I don't know, you export more, then other countries have more money in your currency, which is good. Um, yeah.
Okay. Why would it be good if people have more, like there's more of a demand for your currency?
I mean, it can also be good or bad. It depends. Like, it
Yeah.
can be bad because it makes your currency more expensive, and then it means you're less competitive. So you can no longer export cheaply. But I think it's also good because then it stabilizes your currency. It's less vulnerable to like shocks and stuff like this. And other countries have incentives to make sure that there's no immediate risk to your currency suddenly devaluating to such an extent that it affects their economies.
That's also actually very good, very fair. So on like a practical note, when it comes to currencies, yes, when it, for example, does increase the demand, it does become more expensive. There's one of those things where because you will already be trading more, you still make a profit. So it's one of those things where it mitigates the amount of things that you can trade, but it doesn't mean that you still on that trade more because, via just the assumption that you have more trade, you'll still be overall better off than if you had less trade. But it becomes very specific, important when it comes to specific resources. So if it is the reason why you trade more is because you have a lot of oil, and that's the main thing that's driving up the price of your currency, and that means that other sectors do become uncompetitive because again, then your car industry becomes more expensive than maybe the German ones, and then people just buy the German cars instead of yours ones. So you're also correct in the sense that if this one specific sector, it does affect all the other stuff. And then the volatility and just having a higher demand for your currency is an absolutely fair. It's a good way to become more resilient against like supply shock issues or crisis in general. Okay, I think these are all really good answers, but I think they kind of show that you're still thinking a bit too big. You're still thinking a bit too much on like the larger scale stuff. Easier trade can just be boiled down to, for example, just having a lot of like quicker trade, which means there's going to be like less bureaucracy to go through, and therefore there's a quicker ease for companies to get what they need, or people to get products they need. So if there's, for example, a big shortage on something, so maybe, for example, cars or maybe chips, that kind of stuff, it's just easier to get. Another thing is when it comes to like just like you have more products, right? So if there's more trade, it means that you just have more products that you can buy, which is good because they're often also tend to be cheaper because they need to compete, and therefore just people have more money they can spend. And also, I think what Elon also said, like you have just more GDP growth, you have more jobs because of that trade. All of that's just very much nice. But the important thing that I want to note here is people tend to stay very much on either the very abstract level of GDP grows or people get more jobs, but they don't really impact or weigh necessarily why the specific things that are just very easy to get for more trade are actually that important or that meaningful. And I want to highlight it here so that when later on I am talking about impacts, you can just take on all this impacting and all of this weighing to then apply this to the arguments, and then we can just keep on that like large scale level. But I want you to know that you should still do the nitty gritty work of impacting weighing. So, for example, we're talking about like a bigger ease of transport, it also means that there's more stability that you have. So either because you are able to just buy in more bulk, and therefore if one of the shipments goes rogue, then you also have 5 other shipments coming that are completely fine. But also if there's like a shortage coming through, then you don't need to wait weeks and weeks with bureaucracy and red tape to kind of like catch a new order to then solve a supply issue that you have. Which means that it's easier to respond to crisis, or you have less crisis in general. And it's overall good because that might actually, for example, lead to a company needing to fire people or needing to increase the prices for products because they suddenly have all of these supply issues. And this is also important because if an important thing of like having less crisis is that people kind of like know what to expect. So oftentimes people are fine with maybe having a lower quality of life or maybe like less money if that is more stable. Whereas at the moment that is something is taken away from you, there's sometimes a shock, there's something unexpected, sometimes leads to a lot of like stress because now things are different than the way they were before. And that's why oftentimes people just don't really like crisis, and it's just very hard to deal with emotionally, but also just pragmatically. Like yes, you might have saved up, but then again, if everything suddenly starts to cost more, then you're very quickly through your savings, and it leads to a lot of like issues still. For example, with still paying your mortgage and that kind of stuff. And this is the kind of level of detail that you should do when you're impacting. It's explaining exactly how it affects individual and why that effect is so big and why that effect is the most important thing. So for crisis, you could say there's a very big group. It's also very deep, very stressful, all of that kind of stuff. Similar thing for like cheaper products is sometimes people say like, you just have cheaper products or you have more choice. And then it just, stays there. Well, oftentimes an easy argument to make after that is that people can self-actualize. So when products are cheaper, it's easier for people to, for example, save up money and use that money to get educated or to buy a course or to get education for the children. It's like a generic example which shows it's very good for growth. But also you could just say that sometimes it's just very simple as just being able to upgrade your house. So you finally have the wood, for example, to insulate, or make a shed, and therefore you're able to, maybe use your garden, or it's easier to create insulation for your house, and therefore you don't have as many cold winters, and it significantly increases the quality of life that you have. And people are able to do this in a very meaningful way because people just know what the specific needs are that they have. And if you just give them the tools, they'll be able to solve those significantly better. And then you can just explain why, again, this is so important for these people. And here is, again, just the level of detail that you need to do. And same thing when it comes to jobs, like Edwin was right, like GDP grows, you have more jobs, you have more trade, of that kind of stuff. But another thing you could talk about jobs is when people don't have a job, they oftentimes not only just lose out on money or lose out on something that they're doing, but also it is just one of those things where it doesn't feel as meaningful to be part of society because it feels like you're taking away, but you're not contributing to it. So if you look at people who are oftentimes like jobless, this is one of the main things they also talk about, even if they are on, for example, benefits from the government, is they feel like they're not contributing to society, not being meaningful, not being productive, and they just kind of like feel like really shitty because of that. And there's another way you could just talk about jobs, not just like people get money and that's good, but also really, again, the psychological effect. Another important thing is to just note the context. So when it comes to, for example, having cheaper products, that's already great. But if you can give it in the context of inflation or in the context of a living, like cost of living crisis, then having cheaper products suddenly becomes significantly more important. So also use the little snippets of econ that you might know or the context that you can use to kind of like explain why it's important. Same with jobs, like just having more jobs is intuitively good, but you still need to explain why maybe this leads to competition between jobs and therefore people also get better pay, even if there isn't a huge amount of people who are jobless or like unemployed. But if you're able to say actually there's a lot of structural reasons why currently there's a high level of unemployment, then again creating more jobs also becomes suddenly an imperative. Like you're actually solving a specific problem that society is going through. And again, this lastly is like, don't forget to also be explicit on any weighing metrics that you have. So it's like, the most vulnerable people. So you're focusing on like the poor countries or the poor citizens, or it's a huge size, or there's a huge severity of impact. I feel like the moment you not only do this, but also call this out, saying that, look, people can't just say you have more GDP and that's good, or you have more tax and that's good, and then call it a day. They do actually need to give you reasons and explanation why what they're saying is impacting people and why that's the most important thing. So oftentimes you do need to be very explicit on this. And it might be very useful to differentiate yourself against teams who don't, even in high rooms. So are there any questions on like these basics? Great. I assume not. Now let's just talk about supply chain and specifically just the compatibility of trade. So a lot of the examples are very specific, which have to do with the Mercosar EU trade deal, for the very simple reason that I originally made this workshop for people who needed to prep that motion, so they can use these examples. So just a very quick way to kind of like see how supply chains actually work. So often what you just need is you need to have raw resources, such as raw iron. That's oftentimes a very specific place. It's just a very specific country. So these can be in Africa. We have different countries which have a lot of like iron mines, but also, for example, Brazil, which has quite some raw iron. This then oftentimes needs to be processed into like half fabricate or processed to something that then can be used for later things, which is oftentimes steel. So this oftentimes gets done in either developing nations like China or India or Vietnam, but also oftentimes still in developed nations when they just have very good specific industries. So, for example, Germany still has a lot of like steel places, like steel factories, where they use the raw iron. And oftentimes what they then do is they then afterwards either sell these half fabricates again back to developing nations for a very high price, being very lucrative for the rest of the nations, but not so much for the developing nations, or they are processing themselves and afterwards selling even the higher quality stuff later on for a high price. So, for example, when you're talking about the car supply line afterwards being processed to steel, it then becomes things like vehicle components. So just think about like just the steering wheel, all that kind of stuff. And afterwards, you also just have vehicle assembly, which then also is again in places like, for example, France or Germany, which have a lot of the assembly factories, but then also sometimes somewhat more developing nations. So Mexico is like a growing economy, is still relatively strong. So that also has these kind of factories. There's a growing car industry, which again why the US is so mad at them for taking that car industry. And then afterwards, you basically just have made that car and then you sell that and basically anywhere. Again, anywhere in the world you can find cars. So this can be oftentimes again to developing nations where the developed nations just take a large profit of the fact that they basically sold something back to these nations where they use their raw resources or their even products that they made there to assemble it. So the important thing here to note is that supply chains also actually interconnect. So even when you just think about very basic things about the way that you want to create half fabricates, or if you want to get all of this iron out the ground, you oftentimes need things such as like heavy machinery, which oftentimes gets produced with specific tech that you need, which is, for example, in developing nations. So, for example, Germany. But also a very important one is, for example, chips. So currently there's kind of like a monopoly on the chip industry where there's only one company creating machines that create chips, which is ASML, a Dutch company, which is in Eindhoven. And basically, it has a really strong hold on that market. But that's also, again, if you want any machine to work, you kind of like need a chip. If you want for your phone, you need a machine that makes chips. Or if you just want to make a machine that, again, assembles cars, you also need a chip within that machine. So this is, again, something where oftentimes developing nations are very dependent on developed nations because they need all of those high-end products to really become a growing industry and maybe work with even the half fabricates or even just the extraction of raw materials. And it also shows that it's just not as simple, and sometimes it's also just very much interconnected. So another thing that just then gets solved when you just have more trade or you just have trade barriers, all that kind of stuff, is that's just easier and cheaper to just deal with the supply chain logistics. So oftentimes you can just think about just having less bureaucracy. This doesn't really get talked about enough in debates, but there's oftentimes quite some red tape that you need to go through. So if you follow the workshop from me on banks, you know that banks oftentimes give papers between international trading companies. So if one company wants to, for example, import a lot of bananas from Brazil, then I need to the company who is selling the bananas needs to make sure that they get paid, because again, if they just export it and they don't get paid, and they're basically screwed. And the person who is importing the banana needs to know that the bananas are actually going to be sent, otherwise they're basically sending money for nothing. So oftentimes you have like letters of trust or that kind of stuff from international organizations or international banks or just big national banks, who are basically then making it easier for you to believe that actually you're going to get the things that you need, and therefore there's going to be more international trade that happens. But you can understand that just going through that, there might be a lot of bureaucracy where you kind of like need to prove that you have these shipments. You also need to make sure that the bananas, for example, have a specific kind of like weight, that they are not used with specific pesticides. You need to make sure that, if they are international, sometimes there are extra restrictions on how much you are selling and all that kind of stuff. Or if there's a problem potentially with also international drug trade or like weapon trade, then there also need to be extra checks that you don't have, those kind of like weapons coming through, all of that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of like red tape that is with that, not only just setting up, contracts with banks, but also just make sure it's being checked and international trade happens. And I can just put in like large delays for like, supply chains, and that can be significantly uplifted when you just have more trade deals where it's just easier, you have less bureaucracy, you have to go less through these checks, but also to a certain extent it's just a bit easier. So if you are more experienced with dealing with Brazilian companies, then you better understand what they mean when they say that you will get the paper soon, or it will be in like 3 to 5 work days, and the access actually is like within a week or like in 2 weeks. Like you're more used to it, you kind of like know how to deal with that. You maybe also just have people in place who are able to deal with the bureaucracy better, because they're, again, not only have the experience, but they also just know Brazilian law better, all that kind of stuff. So this is the way in which also just doing it more often just becomes easier. And there's just also just a very easy one, which is just if there are less tariffs and there's just less cost for trade, then it just becomes cheaper to do so. And therefore it's easier for you to deal with this. And this is just very nice, because this just leads to more stability, like I said, via large orders, but also less things are likely to go wrong or get lost, or you don't have to deal with all those layers of bureaucracy. Yeah, Oana.
I just have a question about the papers. Who gives the papers to whom?
So
The banks to the suppliers, or the like importer?
so it's like so the way it works is just you have a third party, and that third party verifies if something happens. So for example, if I want to import bananas, I, for example, put the money into account, and then the bank can see that I put the money into the account, and they could access and then make the transfer towards the banana exporter, and then the bank can write to the banana exporter, look, we had the account, is the money, you can send the shipment away. And then it can also then, when the bank has somehow checked, for example, if the shipment is there and the exporter has given sufficient proof and has shown the papers that indeed the bananas, a ship with bananas, is in the port in Brazil and it is going to leave now, then they can send a message to the importer being like, hey, we have actually concluded that yes, they are sending the shipments, so we're going to release the funds, or we're going to release half of the funds now, and we're going to release the other half when the export actually arrives. Something like that.
I see.
Does
So
that make sense?
basically, yeah, due diligence of banks on trade, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And this becomes even more complicated when it comes to agriculture. So specifically with agriculture, there has been historically a lot of problems with not knowing whether you're going to have a crisis, or if you're going to know how much wheat you're actually going to produce, if you're going to have a plague, which then kills a lot of crops, or maybe suddenly you have a uniquely rainful year and it's very good for your crops, so suddenly you have a lot of crops. All of those things lead to a lot of like fluctuation in prices, a lot of unknowns for both the importer and exporter if they're going to, get the money or get the goods that they wanted. So there's oftentimes a lot of like regulation, a lot of contracts in place. There's a lot of like government oversight, like government funding as well. Like, if you lose a lot of money, we might give you this amount of money and that kind of stuff. So this even shows another problem, which is just like if there's an unpredictability in the market, it also means a lot of other bureaucracy that you need to go through by showing how much you've produced, how much you're selling, all that kind of stuff. All that needs to be logged so that they can then use the regulations to, for example, deal with crops not being as successful as maybe predicted. So that's another big issue specifically within agriculture. But that's just a more specific niche thing on sector. So now that I've basically told you about like stability and less things that can go wrong, it's just easier maybe to buy in bulk. Let's just remind you guys, how does this then impact the individual? How can you impact this back towards the individual?
I think maybe just making their job easier. So, for example, the little guys on the ground have an easier job, and they can be more efficient and also be paid properly. I'm thinking of I saw a news title when there was this like barrier, I think after Brexit or after the Brexit regulation came into place, and then they started, oh, excuse me, they started confiscating like the lunches of like truck drivers who are crossing borders because there were tariffs on them, or something like this. Yeah, or they weren't allowed to bring, I don't know, jars or something like that.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting point about like, just the everyday basic stuff like the workers. I think it's a very like secure impact that you definitely can run. It's maybe a bit like a small group and maybe like a small like harm that you can run, but it's definitely a secure impact that you can run. I think it's just like maybe a bit of an easier case that you can bring, and it has to do with the fact that I already said stability due to larger orders. And this is again where you could say stability is good in international trade because then companies don't need to lay off people, you don't get the problems with unemployment. People need security so they can able to predict what they need to do with financial situations, all that kind of stuff. Or again, if it's just like cheaper, that you can just talk about, you just have a lot of goods. If you have a lot of goods, they also become cheaper. You just can do more stuff. You can self-actualize more, all of that kind of stuff. So it's again, I think you're all like maybe sometimes thinking a bit too deeply and too hard, where it's just sometimes just already in your face. Sometimes you just need to go back to lower prices, employment, and just things like stability. Those are often very easy arguments you can make within any econ debate. So let's then work on the last thing. I think this is also something that Irina talked about in like her examples, like the mid to long range. It's easier to create maybe new branches or is able to specialize as a country. So what I call this is like horizontal and vertical expansion because that makes sense in my mind. Because the way I see it is that you just have, a work like from the way down and then the way up. So down is just the raw iron and then up are the cars. And if you just have horizontal expansion, it's just sometimes you have maybe a very booming car industry in Brazil, like a car assembly, but you don't have one for like maybe electric scooters. So what that means is you're basically oftentimes able to use the same supply line, which is similar raw irons that you need or similar like steering wheels, like similar like chips that you need to kind of like make it, and then it's easier to basically branch off and then create a different sector that is similar to it but is still something that uses somewhat similar supply lines and methods. So this would be electric scooters, which would be horizontal. But also, again, if you just have maybe already more scooters, then it also means that you might need to branch out into different sectors or go on top of that, which is maybe if you have these like apps in cities where you can just, rent these electric scooters, then you also need an app to develop it. You also need to get investors. You also need to make sure it's marketed, all the kind of stuff, which then creates a new company on top of the scooters for like app creation, marketing, all of this kind of stuff. And all of those things just become significantly easier the easier it is to set up a company, expand a business, or yeah. So it's like either new startups or the already existing business expands into a new sector because it's just easier to get the things that they need. They have more confidence in the market. It's cheaper for them to get the goods that they need to make these scooters, and therefore you just create new jobs, new innovation. You are able to often also, especially if it's vertical extension, working in different sectors. E.g., if you already have like booming, car industries, and you have like more apps popping up, then that also then means that you have a new tech industry and more service industry that's easier for you to create in the long run. So if you have more education already on like maybe creating software, or you already have more familiarity for investors to invest in your like maybe starting up tech industry, it's easier for people to not just work in maybe more labor intensive jobs, just agriculture or industry, but then also in like the service industry where you just need to have a bit of education to then work a 9 to 5 behind the laptop instead of like slaving away in a car manufactory trying to assemble cars. So yeah, that's just the compatibility of the trade. I feel most of this is intuitive, but I feel like it's oftentimes important to have a great level of detail in how this works. Because if you have a great level of detail of how this works, then you're able to expand the scope, and you can also be more specific with your impacts. So now competition. So competition within trade is just, two ways in which this can happen. I think there's just direct competition, which can just be very useful. If you have two companies that are now selling cars, and it's easier for them to trade. So it's not just that we in the Netherlands have cheap access to German cars, but also we have cheap access to Brazilian cars or Mexican cars. It is easier for you to just, have easier for me to maybe buy a cheaper car, like a Mexican car, and then other cars that are from Germany need to create a new niche that they're catering to. So if they say like, we are more expensive, then we might try to focus on maybe a niche crowd who's willing to pay that extra money. So people who want, for example, electric cars, or people who need like off-road cars and like need to be more what's it called? Like you need to be stronger for them to deal with the off-road situations. And therefore we're going to go to those cars. And this is good because then again, those niche markets suddenly get more money pumped in. They have more innovation there. It becomes cheaper for people. People are able to better find the cars they need because it just better fits what they need. And this then can be, depending on the specific sector, very important or not important. So sometimes people just be like, this just happens in general and this is good, and then they're not specific about the sector. But when it comes to, for example, cars, you could just explain that actually having a car that is better on fuel is just very good, because this often means it's not just impacting the environment and direct air pollution within cities, but also it just means that it's significantly cheaper because oil is very expensive. So oftentimes, taking up your car and needing to do it a lot is just a very big cost on individuals. And also cars in general are a big cost for individuals, either via insurance or via like the fact they just need to pay an expensive car. And therefore, if you're able to get this cheaper, this significantly influences the amount of spending they can have. And then again, if you do specifically in the context of a cost of living crisis, where there's a lot of people who are either, barely making ends by, or are really needing to cut down on their spending, it's just really good to suddenly have access to cheaper goods, especially in expensive parts of their lives, such as cars. So that is how you use that specificity to make an economic argument, not just generic, but also very important. Another thing to notice is just comparative advantage. And it's just one of those things where even if an industry loses, the country can still win overall by specializing in a different industry. So the basic example that I have here is, let's say you have 10 monies or 10 euros, and then you have two countries, two hypothetically fictional countries called France and Germany, where from that 10 monies, France is able to make 60 euros worth of beers and 50 euros of wines. Germany, on the other hand, can make 100 euros worth of beers and 60 euros of wines. Now, the idea of the comparative advantage is basically that Germany is going to focus on producing beers because it can make the most, like the largest profit on that. They can make 90 euros of pure profit, and then they can sell it to France. And then France, on the other hand, is basically losing on both fronts. It's losing on both beer production and wine production. However, because for Germany it's better to focus on beers, it now opens up the opportunity for France to focus now on their wine industry. Because for Germany, it's one of the things they could also create wine, but they could just make way more money just focusing on beers. And therefore, it's just better. And therefore, France and Germany both win. Because both of them have now an industry that is competing, they're specializing in it. And again, you can have all of these nice knock-on effects. I think Rina also just highlight this, which is if you're, for example, just focusing on wine, then maybe you're able to find niche new ways to, I don't know, create bubbly wine that is now, I don't know, not super duper expensive and only from the region of, the north of France or whatever. Or you're able to maybe, I don't know, maybe find suddenly non-alcoholic wines, which is good because now people are consuming less alcohol. It's like a very basic example of what I mean. But it's a good way to create a relatively stable way to still have innovation where both countries win. So there isn't necessarily a lose-lose situation here. It's rather a win-win situation. So this is all very nice. So these are all the positive of trades. So let me now ask you a question. Is there any problem that we can foresee with trade?
I mean, you have the
Uh,
classical example. Oh, I'm sorry. If you want to go, you can go.
No,
Go
you
on.
can go. You can go.
You
Okay.
go.
I think you just have the classical example of if people are upskilling, that doesn't go infinitely. So there will be for example, in America, in like the Rust Belt, you have a lot of iron workers who simply don't have jobs anymore, just because it's obviously significantly cheaper to do it in East Asia, for example, to have people work in factories there. So there's no reason to employ people in the US in similar factories, but there are still people who need those factory jobs to have access to just income because they aren't capable of moving randomly because it's quite a high burden that you put on yourself to move socially because you're leaving your community, blah 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 blah, leaving family, but also just money. You can't just randomly buy a house, so it's quite harmful for a person to have to move. And education isn't accessible for everyone.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you two questions now on this to kind of like just make this a bit clearer and a bit stronger. So what is the specific thing? Why does comparative advantage not work here? So why does the Rust Belt in the US not able to specialize in a different industry?
Because you need for example, one, there's like a limited amount of demand for example, chips. You can't just infinitely stack chip factories and that'll mean infinite profit. So there's also just a cap that you have to work with. But also specifically, those industries have really high skilled laborers that they need. And intuitively, not everyone is a high skilled laborer. Not everyone has the same access to education and stuff like that. So lower skilled laborers are likely to be phased out when you focus on a specific thing, or just anyone that's in that industry and can't keep up.
That's a really good explanation of why the comparative advantage actually might not work. Just because the sector that is just not creating the same kind of jobs, and therefore you just don't have an easy transition. The second question that I have for you is you're talking about like, those jobs now go to Vietnam or to maybe other developing or like other developing nations and maybe Southeast Asia. What if the response from the other side is, well, yes, maybe you lose jobs in the US, but it isn't as bad because again, the US has at least some form of a social security net. But creating jobs in developing nations is more important because there's less of a social security net. Therefore, they would be worse off if they wouldn't have jobs. So actually, the transport of jobs is actually a good thing because it helps the most vulnerable people.
Can I jump on that, or do you want to respond?
I'm fine with you responding. Yeah, I'm fine with you responding.
Okay. Well, I think for me, this is actually also the most intuitive thing about comparative advantage. Even if it works perfectly domestically, if you look at it from a big scale, it traps countries into low income sectors where they are exploited for a profit for particular countries that are already developed. Because the countries that have the capacity to focus on uh, high income, high earning sectors are countries that already have quite sophisticated technology and have a lot of investors. So these are already developed countries, usually the West. And then you have countries that start off and the West tells them, well, open up for trade. oh, well, all the high-tech sectors are taken, or you don't have the workforce to do that. So why don't you start with agriculture? Why don't you start with mining? Why don't you start with natural resource exploitation? And that traps people into quite bad jobs with terrible conditions where they are kind of forced to give in to foreign investors because that seems to be the only economic path for the country at that point in time when they already made the trade deal, when they already want the investment. And I know there's two sides to say, well, at least they have some jobs and at least they have some development. But the problem is the kind of leverage that investors usually get in these contexts makes really unfair deals for the countries involved and then creates uh, exploiting labor conditions, creates climate change
Yeah,
externalities,
yeah.
and so on.
I think this is fair, and I think this is important to notice here that we're kind of like presuming is that the jobs beforehand or like the jobs that exist in the alternative would still be relatively better, like they would be less exploitative. And I think maybe a way to also make this intuitive how you can actually prove this in debate is when you look at, for example, South Korea. South Korea was actually quite poor for quite a long time in the 20th century, especially after the Korean War. But then afterwards, what they did is they created different forms of competition between companies that they had, and then they nationalize the companies and they give like protection to those companies to then grow. So then you get like new tech giants popping up. So that's how like Korea was able to actually create a internal like tech market by just protecting itself and having competition and then afterwards selling it. And what you're saying is it's very fair, which is at the moment you have these traders, for example, with the West, you already have a lot of like quite good marks, maybe cars and all that kind of stuff. So if you to specialize in a different kind of industry within the same high level of tech, would be hard for you. But if you're able to maybe create tariffs, or if you may be able to create like a place where you have government subsidies, all that kind of stuff, that does become more possible. So it's just me adding on what you're saying. But I feel like Owana also has a very important thing that she wants to say because she has her hand raised.
I mean, I don't know if it's that important. I think I wanted to say something very similar also on competitive advantage. I think regardless which country it is, it's bad because by the virtue of focusing on one thing, you're more vulnerable in case of like shock or crisis. And I think this can be illustrated also based on like Irina was saying, natural resources, for instance. And I think that's a really big thing because that's not sustainable long term because you will run out of, I don't know, oil, you will run out of like diamonds or whatever, right? But also just it disencourages the like building up other industries because you have the natural resources which on the short term are easier to extract. But even if it's not a natural resource, you, I don't know, if something is up in the like logistic or like in the supply chain, if like there is a drought somewhere, then suddenly you cannot produce your like flour anymore in like on the other side of the planet, right? So that makes you like, it puts you up for more risk. And this is quite common, like during COVID it happened a lot with like with suppliers who weren't able to transport, but also just like I don't know if there's a shortage in something like with chips. Yeah.
This is very fair. Another thing to note here is if you look at, for example, an example where a supply chain issues goes wrong is when Ukraine was invaded by Russia.
Yeah.
And the war started, there were like huge supply issues with grain, which like it did affect Eastern Europeans and like Western European countries, but it more harshly impacted like of African and especially North African nations who used the trade with Ukraine and their wheat to kind of like get their food supply. So it does also lead to a lot of like issues if you just don't have competing sectors. It is also one of those things though where there's always nuance to this, right? Because if you, for example, would be able to produce your own food like we do in the Netherlands, then like you are getting at least some supplements in the sense that yes, maybe bread will become more expensive because we can buy wheat from the from Ukraine, but we still have a very big potato potato fact like not potato factory, like potato agricultural companies. So therefore you're able to make up that loss by just eating less bread and eating more potatoes. But again, for other nations, significantly harder, right? So for example, North African nations, if you have Egypt, one of the most populated countries within North like Africa in general, a lot of the population is just around the Nile because that's the only livable place and does therefore have a lot of agricultural places in the first place. Just because it's a desert, but also a lot of the places that are potentially agriculturally viable are also heavily populated with cities. So yeah, it is one of the things where again here level of specificity about what the sectors are and why you can or cannot compete is something that is going to make the impact even larger. Irina, do you want to go on? Like get into this
Yeah,
as well?
sorry. But just
No.
I mostly am with you on this, but I do have to also point out the opposite, which is on the one hand, that international trade can also be a means to quote unquote for neoliberalists achieve peace. So basically, interdependence is good because it makes people more willing to cooperate with each other. It's not to say I necessarily agree with this, but I do see a benefit in saying Trump is quite radical, and the fact that he's putting tariffs on China is not your most intuitive way to go when you have such a big amount of the trade going on from the US with China and how that's going to impact global supply chain, right? So, unless you have somebody who is really stubborn as this guy, you're more likely to have sort of mediating arrangements where countries kind of try to make each other happy rather than be confrontational because they don't want to fuck up their economies.
Yeah,
That's
I feel like this
one
is
thing.
yeah, okay, and then there's a
I
second
had
thing.
another thing to say, yes. I'm sorry. But
No, go
um,
on.
I was also thinking to build up your own industries, while again, I do agree that's actually the better way to go, looking at how exploitative it can be if you don't do that and the risks you have with depending on only one thing. I think there are some limitations to that. And I think if you look at, I think Argentina, it was throughout the years and how it developed, it was very protectionist for a while. And then it found it hard to be able to actually compete with other industries once it opened up. So it just had to keep on pouring government subsidies into different industries because people got used to a particular standard of living. Like they thought my company is competitive and I have this many jobs here and I want to keep that amount of jobs. And that pattern can be reproduced elsewhere. And the problem with that is then you accumulate public debt or well, it depends on where you get the funding to do these from, right? Because if you get it from
Yeah,
government subsidies, then you might accumulate debt, and that might be a bad thing. If you get it from foreign investors, they might put pressure on predatory practices like not caring about regulations, and that's bad. So, yeah, I don't know. I just thought about it and thought it might be good to bring to the discussion.
that's all very good. I'm gonna give two notes on this, and then I'll go on to like my slides about what the problems are for trade. But given that we already had quite an in-depth discussion, I think I can go shorter over a couple of the lines. So when it comes to like the integration part, and therefore you have more peace when you have more trade. Like again, the generic example against this is we fought the exact same thing of World War One and World War Two, and well, not maybe World War Two, but definitely World War One. And guess what happened? We had a very big World War, and a lot of people died. And I think again, this is also very much a question debate where you could characterize how likely is it for people to have again very protectionist leaders rise up like Trump and all that kind of stuff. So this is also definitely just a question debate that you can consider on either side. Another thing that you can consider when it comes to integration is the EU is also very much formed as just having integration with like trade and just having this more and more. So you have like, okay, you have common trade, but then the problem becomes you also need to export like currencies. Well, if you have like a lot of currencies and you have like free trade between countries, then you also need to actually have somewhat of a border control or actually have maybe imposed tariffs together because otherwise, the problem becomes that, you have suddenly companies like importing from one specific country, then forgoing any tariffs that goes and happens from other countries, e.g., I don't know, Netherlands was off tariffs on cars, but then Greece doesn't, and then Greece is able to buy off cars, and because of their free trade, it's easy for Greece to then just have that transport go to the Netherlands. And then you have all this integration that needs to work together on all the fronts, either having subsidies, making sure that those are effective, having tariffs, or having protectionist things in place for their sectors. Another thing is just having, if you, for example, have an agricultural sector in different countries, then you might want to focus on not having an overproduction of agriculture because that drives down the prices for everyone. So then you also want to maybe have a shared policy on like quotas on how much agricultural products can be produced, like sugar, all of that kind of stuff. And that surely has a level of integration where certainly you have shared currencies, you have shared policies, which kind of like leads to like a lot of like unification, where it's very unlikely that within the EU you're going to have a war. And this also is something that you can talk about within the African Union, where you have not just the African Union, but you also have different countries with different regions within Africa, which have their own different unions, which also are having some levels of free trade. So I think there's one of the East African like group of nations which tries to have like similar levels of trade, also tries to make sure that you have open markets, all of that kind of stuff. And there's a similar way in which you can have this level of integration, which doesn't just affect stability and having less war, but also just again maybe prosperity. You get EU projects which are EU funded. This is also become possible if you have more of these trading blocks that are happening. So that's another like maybe context in which this specifically can take place. And when it comes to your example of Argentina, I think it's also very fair. I think this is why it's important to think of what the kind of motion this is. If this is a this house would or this house believes that X should Y, then what you should do is most likely be like, we're going to use all of the nice tricks that South Korea used on why they're productive. And then we're going to ignore all of the issues that Argentina have by not doing these things that basically messed up the country. But if it's again maybe this house supports, this house opposes, and you don't have that fiat, then going again into the nitty gritty of why did it fail in Argentina or why did it fail in why succeed in South Korea, and why is it likely or unlikely in this debate to be reproduced, is also something that is just important to note. Sadly, I can't go into detail about this in this workshop because this will be very long. I think this is just one of those things where you can research this after this workshop. But okay, that's a lot of good points that we now discussed with potential problems with trade. Let's just look at what I had written down. So another thing that we have with competition, I think this also gets to the kind of like neo-colonial point or like the post-colonial point that Irina highlighted, is sometimes when you just have big companies coming in, it's just kind of like unfair competition and kind of like destroys industries. So it might be an power balance because maybe some governments have giving or have are continuing to give or have in the past given a lot of subsidies to specific companies or sectors, and therefore it's very easy for them to outcompete other companies who maybe don't have that, maybe because they are from a poor state, but also maybe just have a lot of like name recognition, which means a lot of consumers will just, for example, buy a Coca-Cola, or within the industry, they're like, Coca-Cola is very stable, it's very wise investments. So in my like, trade, I'm going to maybe prefer Coca-Cola than maybe this local brand that's going to, you're going to have access to. And therefore you basically just actually don't have that much competition. A specific thing that you can also use here is like how powerful marketing can be. Like a lot of the times products are basically sold not because they're actually that much greater, but because of marketing. So if you look at Apple hasn't been upgrading their phones that much. They've actually been downgrading a lot of things with like battery life and actually making sure that you have significantly more wear and tear, which means you're going to buy it quicker. But then they have specific features suddenly get better, like, oh wow, we have these emojis or we have a better camera, and that becomes a very big hype, and that becomes like the new big thing why you should get the iPhone. And this oftentimes really able to sell off people, where even if it's a downgrade on other levels, it's an upgrade on one or a couple of sectors, and that becomes suddenly the most important thing. And if you just have so much money and you're able to use that for the marketing, you basically are able to make sure that other companies who maybe have a better quality product are just not able to succeed, because again they're just using all the money that they have. Another thing is that they might have unfair practices. So this is something that oftentimes comes down when you have trade deal within developing nations and developed nations, where you can say, well, in developing nations you have like maybe easier laws for pollutions, or they are able to maybe exploit labor laws, and therefore it's actually unfair because they're able to make them the worst conditions for cheaper, and therefore it's really hard for us to compete with them. Again, this is specifically within agriculture, because if you look, for example, at European policy for, or even Dutch policy for agriculture, there are a lot of things where it's like, you have all of these quotas, you have all of these conditions on making sure it doesn't produce too much CO2 or nitrogen. And also there need to be livability standards for animals. And also you need to be sure that you're catering this well towards, what people want, which is also like a low price, but then also being sustainable, all that kind of stuff, which means it's very hard to kind of like fill in all of these things. But then if you're from a different country and you don't have that oversight, then it's easier to maybe bend the rules there or just not comply with them at all, because they just don't hold within your country. Another thing is actually also, again, if you have big companies, what they might do is they drown the markets with goods, so they become significantly cheaper than any other alternative. And then the moment when other companies are basically going down, or when other companies basically butt up, then what happens is they're going to hike up the price because there's no competition anymore. E.g., it's possible to create monopolies. And you can say it's very hard to regulate them and stop them, because again, they have maybe a lot of lobbying power. Maybe they already have a lot of like ins within the trade deal. So again, oftentimes also trade deals are made with, either lobbied by these big companies, or there's also like spokesperson from the like think tanks who are often also influenced by, these companies because they're either were formerly by these companies or they're funded by these companies. So there's a lot of like direct and indirect ways in which these trade deals can actually also be influenced by companies. And therefore you could say that this can often have these perverse incentives already built into it. So when you're actually debating the motion, it does actually warrant that you're going to focus about all of these, bad things that can happen, such as monopoly creation. Another thing to note is the comparative advantage. I think this already was quite worked out by Idan, which is you just need to have another industry that you can work on, but also sometimes you need to pivot. So I think this is also what Irina was saying when we were talking about like Argentina. Let's say you're really trying to maybe, have a booming industry, you're giving a lot of like funds to it, but then suddenly you're opening up and you're trading and you're seeing we're kind of like losing this war. Then if you are unwilling to kind of like pivot to another industry, then you might just pump in all of these funds, given all of this money, and that might just lead to a lot of debt. It also leads to a lot of opportunity cost because that money could have spent on developing other sectors, developing healthcare systems, developing education, all of that kind of stuff. So I think this is also just another way that you could talk about the comparative event not working. And it's also, again, very specific to the specific sector. So again, I'm just going to use the Netherlands example. There's a lot of farmers' protest in the Netherlands because the nitrogen laws that were implemented because of environmental issues. And then basically we had huge protests of farmers. Now we have a farmer party, which is within the coalition. So it's very unlikely that now you're going to have anything that's going to cut down on funding for these kind of like farmers, farmers or from the agriculture sector, even though it might be better for the Netherlands to maybe focus less on agriculture and maybe try to compete in other stuff when they should. Another thing, and I think this hasn't been discussed yet, and it's just other countries can kind of like be screwed over by trade in the sense that trade is not absolute. So, for example, when the Netherlands or Germany, which is the EU, is just trading more with Brazil, that sometimes means that they just buy less stuff from other places, either because, again, there's just replacement going on. So, if we don't buy cars from Mexico, but now buy them from Brazil, then, Mexico is losing out. And sometimes it's just that these other places that are losing out are just more vulnerable that we should care for, or maybe there are better for another couple of reasons. So maybe these other places have better environmental or like labor regulations, and therefore we should care more for actually using their products than maybe having the products with this specific trade deal. So these might be Romania, Greece, for example, or other Eastern European nations that aren't part of the EU, for example, that might lose out when you have a trade deal between the EU and Latin American countries. So these are just a couple of the problems that I think we already talked about quite a lot in the discussion section. And then another thing, which I think also was highlighted by Irina, which is especially the way these traders are uptime set up, you're just going to have significantly more demand for different kinds of things. But oftentimes the reason why we want trade with these developing nations is because it is cheaper to produce there. They have cheaper, labor that they can use. They have just like cheaper, like weaker labor protection, they have weaker environmental protection. So therefore the environmental protection just goes worse. And also the competitive advantage just, means that also people on the ground are just having bad jobs. The main problem with this argument that I found when people bring it is that a lot of judges buy the intuition that in the alternative they would be dying on the street because they're unemployed. It's just for most judges intuitive enough that they're like, but at least you have a job. So another thing to notice is one, explain why the jobs actively get worse, but also secondly, maybe explain why the other trade alternatives exist. Another thing that you can note here is, again, trade is not absolute in the sense that if Vietnam is suddenly producing a lot to sell to the US to kind of like go into the market, then they really, really need to now specialize in having lower prices because that is the way that they're able to compete maybe bigger brands within the US. And therefore, to be able to overcome all like marketing and all the kind of stuff, they really need to have that cheaper price. But maybe if the alternative is trying to develop relations with developing nations as well, they might be able to do that for higher prices or better standards because they don't need to compete with that much lower price because they don't have that specific competition, which makes it hard for them. Again, then the problem that most likely you will point out as well, these are going to be other developing nations. then the problem is, again, developing nations don't have that much money, so you also need to be cheap. But also, again, if these are other bigger nations, that they would have the same problem. Each, if you want to sell to maybe Japan or Australia, these are richer nations, which also have the exact same thing with big companies who already have marketing. And therefore, it is possible to sometimes talk about pollution and social inequality, but sometimes the alternative does make it hard. A practical and a tactical notice, if this house supports or this house opposes motion, then actually it doesn't matter, because then you can say, actually, it doesn't matter whether a counterfactual exists or not, or whether a counterfactual is better or worse. We kind of like asking if we support this or if we oppose this. If there's an alternative that's also bad, we're also fine with opposing that. So that's kind of like a sneaky way to get out of it. But I find that this is oftentimes a harder line to kind of like go for. Mm-hmm. And another thing here, which has to do partially with the case on companies kind of like dominating, is just that it's not just that economically they dominate and it's bad for competition and monopolies and all that kind of stuff. And then you can have a whole clash about, are monopolies good? Are they very stable? Or are they able to create innovations by just pumping a lot of like tech in R&D and having a better capacity to develop tech? But maybe they have less incentive because there's no competition going on and people will just buy their goods anyway. All that kind of stuff, like a very generic clash. Another thing that you can just focus on is just talking about the perception of this, and then it becomes more of a narrative debate. So when you're talking, for example, between a trade deal with a developing nation, which is a post-colonial nation, and then you have a developed nation, which is a Western nation, then you could say people don't like these Western companies coming in, either because there's this narrative of like colonialism, or the see this as neo-colonialism, or companies in the West have done terrible things within these countries. If you think of Congo, for example, they cut off the hands of people who were not producing enough, and it was just very terrible kind of like conditions in the rubber industry. So then if maybe like a European company now trades with Congo, that might actually lead to a lot of like backlash within the country, or it makes it more possible to actually have those populist uprisings. So again, this is the thing where you are going to run the Trump case, which is Trump is more likely when you're going to have more dependence on these Western nations, especially when it's going to be perceived to be worse. And then you might say the alternative might actually be, China or other places, or just, again, maybe trading with some of the BRICS countries or just with your local countries. There's countries in your region, and those don't have those perception problems, and then you don't have that instability, all of that kind of stuff. So this is sometimes also like a desperate extension that you need to run. It's just like, it doesn't matter about the pragmatics. People are really good about the econ stuff. We're not going to touch the clash. We're just going to touch the clash about pragmatics, either how it's going to affect like populists and like politics. But another thing you can do here, of course, is impacting how people feel about this. So just like, again, people just feeling shit, people being like anxious, all that kind of stuff is an impact in of itself. Just besides the political backlash and the political upheaval that comes as a consequence from this. So these are the things that we had on just the economics part. Let's just see. Do people still want to talk about the IR part of the trade? Because it's still relatively late and people need to leave.
Yeah, we can talk about it, and I can leave after this part. This is the last part, right?
Let me just double check. I mean, it's going to be 2 slides. I'll try to do this relatively quickly.
That's fine.
So
that's okay.
I think this, to a certain extent, has already been explained by Irina, so we can just do relatively quickly, which is great. That's why discussions are nice. They make the workshop, go quicker, and we just have more examples that we can use. So we have more trade with the country, you have better international relations. And again, this is a level of dependency. But also, I think here you can have more nuance. So when I try to explain, for example, the EU integration part, it shows that sometimes it isn't just about trade that happens, but also about tariffs or maybe protection of borders, all that kind of stuff. So other issues that you have. Or maybe it is one of those things where you're all suffering from like having a lack of diversity in agriculture because of climate change issues. So now you're going to fund research that's going to make it easier for you to produce new crops which are better able to deal with these like situations and that kind of stuff. And you're able to do it because you have more trust in each other, but also you just need to do it together because you just have a greater capacity to fund this kind of research, all of those kinds of stuff. And also, again, when it comes to things like pollution and ecological systems, it is just good to also have other countries in the neighborhood like working with each other, because that means that if you don't pollute the river, but someone upstream does, then that basically means that you're basically going to be screwed over if they don't follow the policies. There's just a collective action issue here that happens as well. So you're going to work these issues out. It's going to be on a government level, maybe it's going to also be on a company level or an NGO level, where you might have sectors coming together and be like, here are all these issues that we have currently. How are we going to try to solve this? And then you're going to try to make it better and basically solve a lot of these issues. Um, a lot of other things you could talk about, and this is more, the different perceptions of like political theories that you have is a lot of debaters focus on you have these structural reasons why you have incentives to do so, and then therefore countries will work together, and that's all fine and dandy. But from the politics course I've taken, there's also different theories which looks actually at other stuff, which is it's not just about institutions or not just about countries and the way they create dependencies. It's also about the different leaders and how they interact with each other. So, for example, when you talk about what's the relationship between the UK and the US, it isn't just about the fact that Trump has like these incentives as, what the US wants, but also if Trump generally sees Starmer as a positive force or something that is good, then he's going to be more lenient with maybe having the trade deals that he has with the UK. And another thing you could say is, again, maybe if you meet more often with these international leaders, and you have more issues that you discuss and maybe different talks, then it is easier for you to trust that other countries are going to solve these issues. But it's also easier for you to maybe pick up the phone, and when you are saying, we have these like calls or we have all of these problems, are you the cause of this? And all the guys, if you're able to resolve possible tensions quicker as well, and you just have more ability to do so. E.g., if you already have a lot of like deals in place, or you already have a lot of like ease of communication, you already know what kind of things the leader wants, then you're able to, get these get better relationships with the country. It's kind of like a use of soft power, the same way that Italy is very strong with this by sending off like cards when it's the holidays or for special occasions to countries. It's kind of like create a goodwill between the leaders. This is something that is a bit more speculative and a bit more hard to prove, but I think it's just one of those things where this is also discussed within international politics studies, as far as I know. And I think it's also good to maybe think of these aspects, especially maybe if you have a debate about Trump, where again, it does really better if Trump really likes you or doesn't like you, and you don't really want to debate about the structural reasons because Trump's unpredictable. So now, having said then why more trade leads to better international relations, or international relationships, as I like to call them, why is it then going to be good? Again, I think this is one of those things where you can have easy arguments by just having more stable trade or flow between countries. You're able to resolve more issues, and it's kind of like making it easier for people to be less dependent on threats. So any trade debate or IR debate has the generic thing. If the US and EU doesn't invest in X country, China will do it, and China is a bad actor. And the way to see this is, China is bad because it puts up a lot of like coercive loans that they set up to fail. So that means they have access to, for example, your mines, or when it comes to Sri Lanka, their ports. They don't really protect any privacy or patent laws. They want you to use Chinese companies, and oftentimes also have Chinese workers go and work within these places, and therefore you don't have that much gain within your country, all of that kind of stuff. And then you also have, again, generic arguments in favor of China, saying, well, look, China has also done a lot of like forgiving of loans, for example, for Pakistan. They don't want you to fold on these loans because it's very expensive, and China doesn't have the want to do it. And also, if they keep screwing over countries, countries don't want you to don't want to engage with China anymore. Like, that's a kind of like very generic clash that tends to happen in IR debates on like whether China is good. But do also know that if you're going to bring the argument that China is a bad actor, not only should you just give these reasons why China is bad, but also try to preempt the kind of like generic rebuttals that will come your way. So actually say, well, no, countries will take these loans, even though they've seen those screw over by other countries before because of these and these reasons, because there's no alternative, or they feel like the IMF will do them worse, or they have an optimism bias and feel like they're not going to default on their loans because of X or Y or Z reason, all of that kind of stuff. Another thing, which also isn't actually done that much, is talk about Russia. Sometimes when it comes to, again, post-USSR nations that are underneath, or to the west of Russia, where it's basically a threat of, Russia wants to interfere in countries, is willing to start wars, as we with Georgia, as we saw with Ukraine, if they feel like it's part of like your if you're trying to get too cozy to the Western countries, and you're kind of like drifting away, and therefore it might be good to try to create relations with these nations as an easier way to not maybe piss off Russia, um, or for them to be less dependent on such a bad actor. But to be honest, a lot of these cases can also actually be run for US or to a certain extent also EU countries, which is if you look at a lot of like IMF loans, they oftentimes are quite coercive still. So they also sometimes have the same things where they're saying, we want you to, have these things as collateral. So these ports or these like mines potentially as collateral. So when you default, we can have access to it. Or we want you to liberalize your economy, which means it's easier for our companies to come into your country. Or you basically cut public funding towards things such as educational healthcare because we don't want you to spend that much money as a government. Instead, just have more right wing things where you just have a smaller budget in general. All of those kinds of things. We can say those are often coercive, might be best for the country, tends to be a lot of like political instability, all that kind of stuff. Again, there's a whole level of nuance here because the way that the IMF has been dealing with issues has been relatively better over the years, in the sense that there has been a lot of criticism within and also outside of the IMF on the way they've structured loans, especially during the Cold War. But there's a way that this is changing, and there's going to be somewhat more ways in which developing nations are able to have more freedom in the way to see the loans. However, this is still an issue that isn't completely resolved. And this is also, I think, a workshop by itself where you could go into detail about here are the cases where the IMF fucked up. Here's the case where the IMF did great. And it becomes one of those things where again, you can be quite specific depending on the debate. So if the debate's about should you pivot, like this house regrets the rise of I don't know, like Chinese investment in X countries, you can then highlight all of these problems with the US and then say even if China is worse, it at least leads to level of competition and that kind of stuff. Another important thing to notice, and this is quite hard in a lot of debates, is there's always a trade-off, and people tend to forget that. So when, for example, it is this house supports, for example, tariffs on electric vehicles from the US on Chinese cars, Chinese electric vehicles, then you could talk about two economies, which is just, it will be bad for China because of these reasons. It will be bad for the US economy for these reasons. But sometimes there's also just like an easier argument, which is if China cannot sell these cars to the US as easily, they will sell them to other nations, like Latin American nations. And that is good because Latin American nations are now going to have more access to these electric vehicles, which is good because they're cheaper or they're better for, the environment. There's less air pollution within cities, all of those kinds of things. So sometimes you can also just bypass the opening half who's talking about China and US by just talking about a completely new actor who's also influenced by this trade, either by losing out or by suddenly gaining an opportunity to get access to the trade. So I hope this gives a good oversight of what you can do with a lot of IR trade debates. Some of it is just purely economic, and I think we went into great detail about that. The IR part is a bit less worked out, but I think the main important thing to notice is it is really dependent on the specific issue, e.g., when it comes to electric vehicles, missing out on something or then becoming closer to another country, it's just dependent on how much do you need the specific thing. So how much do countries really need these loans from China from the One Belt, One Road initiative? Or how much do they really need these cars? If it is a relatively small thing, like the electric cars aren't that important for these countries, then you don't get huge amount of dependence. But then when it comes to other things, you might have like investments, like trade, like all the kind of stuff, like trade deals, then it does become significant. So when it's about the Mercosar-EU deal, this is something that is very clearly pivoting away Latin America away from China. And they could say this is a good thing because of these reasons. But you might also say actually this is a bad for these reasons. So you might say in the context of like trade with Latin America, you might say this comes at the cost of maybe EU trying to seek clearer deals with Southeast Asian countries who might, need this competition between like the EU and China more than, the least Latin American countries need it. And then you can explain why are they more vulnerable in this case? Why would the ways in which they're able to maybe have better relations with EU significantly help their maybe political stability or the way that they're able to resolve maybe climate change issues or other issues? That might again be a possible extension you can run on that debate purely by just looking at actors that are just different than the ones named in the motion. That was a lot of words and that was a lot of information that I gave to you. So I'm just going to ask you, are there any last questions that you want to ask about either the IR part or the econ part?
I have a question, but it's very specific to types of judges. I
Yeah.
think I've raised this before. I think a lot of judges have like kind of a neo-realist bias in the sense that they're more likely to buy like incentive analysis of like you want to do this and this benefits your economy and this doesn't. But I've noticed that they're less likely to buy like I don't know not softer arguments but like arguments like the one about like interpersonal relations and like leader psychology and stuff like that. And I think that argument is an extension. Like I would do that in case I don't have anything else to run. So do you have any general tips on how to make this argument like debate winning even in cases or like at least to get you a second and not a fourth in
Uh,
cases where judges really don't want to buy that kind of argument.
yeah. So I feel like the what you need to do, and this happens whenever you're going against like a bias in debating, is call out that bias. Because oftentimes what happens is teams will not fully explain something. So they'll just hint to it. And there are a lot of implicit jumps or implicit assumptions that they just make. So when they say like, you just create more jobs and that's good for the economy, and then they leave to that, they be like, look, they never really impact why it's good to actually have that many jobs. Or similarly, you could say they do say you create new jobs, but it's unclear why unemployment is so bad that you would need these kinds of jobs. So you just say this goes out, and you say we are going to talk about international relations between countries, and this is more important because of these and these explicit reasons. And then you could say, well, you might assume this is going to be more speculative, but actually the economy is more speculative because of these and these reasons. So then again, you just give a couple of reasons why the other side is actually more speculative, or you point out why they're not fulfilling all of their burdens. Or what you could say is, ah, look, opening gives good reasoning. We're just going to give parallel reasoning, and this will just destroy like up bench, for example. So sometimes you just have a really good OG and you just cannot vertically extend it. So like I say, we're just gonna give parallel reasons. Then this similarly beats like the up bench. Even if it's not as good, it's still sufficient for us to get a second, something like that. Like I've seen teams try to do that. So it's just be explicit, show where there are gaps, and try to preempt the biases that you know exist. Does that make sense? Or do you want me to go into more detail on how to do it in this specific example that you gave?
No, I think this is good. Thank you.
And then another thing is, this is what I learned as well, is like if you are, for example, an ESL speaker and you have like an EPL team, as you say, I might not know the fancy EPL language, but I know like the structural reasons behind it, or like I don't know, like we don't have fancy words to hide on. We're actually just going to prove it, something like that. Or if you are like a woman and you're talking about ecom, like I've heard speakers say like, you should check your biases about what you believe about what is said by whom. And this is oftentimes when you're giving a very empirically heavy case. So when you're talking about, I don't know, microfinance in like Latin American countries, and you talk about how empirically there have been a lot of like things going wrong, and you give a lot of examples, then you can say like, you should still credit this again because empirical proof is proof via the manual, but also you shouldn't discount it just because I'm bringing it and I'm having a higher tone than the guys who spoke before me. Something similar to that. So that might also be useful if you just are from a specific kind of group.
Okay. I did that at Worlds and the panel started laughing.
Yeah, it's I'm not gonna say it gives you a 100% guarantee, but it does sometimes mean that people just need to check their biases. Are there any other questions that we have about IR, econ, trade, anything else? If not, then this was a short exercise that we can just do as a homework. So I'm just read it out loud, and if people back, watching the YouTube video also want to watch this, or would do the homework, and they could do it and they could put in the comments what their answers are. But it's kind of like, friendshoring is an economic strategy where countries prioritize trade relations with nations they have strong diplomatic and or regional ties with, as opposed to maintaining broad global trade relations. This approach has led to countries pulling back on their economic relations with non-allied or less integrated nations, friendshoring has gained traction in recent years due to geopolitical tensions and systemic risks. This house believes that friendshoring does more harm than good. And then the question just becomes, what kind of arguments would you make in favor of this motion, particularly using all of the benefits and negatives that we've given about international trade. But yeah, I think we can stop the recording now, and then everybody who's watching this, I hope this is clear. If you have any questions, you can put it in the comments, and then see you at the next video.